Okay, well, thank you for tuning in and welcome to CTO Talk. I am your host, Matt Ferrari. On this 30-minute program, we get to discuss issues, challenges, and opportunities that are impacting some of you out there in healthcare tech. You can always follow the show at hashtag CTO Talk or follow me at mpferrari on Twitter. With me, really excited today, have Herkemer Sherwood, a development manager at ClearData, who I've had the opportunity to work with for years, and Conor Colgan, a product manager for ClearData, who I've also been able to work with for years, and really wanted to bring these folks on to talk a little bit about natural language processing and machine learning, specifically around an interesting service from Amazon named Comprehend Medical that ClearData, really being driven by Herkemer and some folks that report into his team, and Conor really driving some interesting healthcare use cases. So wanted to think about presenting to the audience today about how can we use some of these cognitive and, in this case, natural language processing services to make some impact in healthcare. So Conor and Herc, welcome to the show. Herkemer, I'd love to start with you. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what a day in the life is like for you?
Well, for starters, a day in the life of me is good. I feel pretty good. My name is Herkemer Sherwood. I've worked with ClearData for a couple of years now, since I believe August of 2015. And I've been working on our products here across the board since then. Started as an engineer and sort of worked my way through the ranks, and I've enjoyed every second of it. I've worked with some of the best and most talented engineers in my career at ClearData. So a day in the life for me usually begins with a couple of early morning meetings, and then the team that I work with is the AWS business unit. So we'll have a scrum each morning that usually lasts somewhere between 15 and 30 minutes, depending on the content on each person's plate. It's a team of 8 or 9 people, and everybody tells me what they're up to, basically, and we make sure that we're working toward our goals for the quarter, and then we say have a good day and get off to work. The rest of the day is mostly just collaborating with people and making sure everybody has the tools that they need to get work done, make healthcare better.
Excellent. And Conor, how about yourself? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, my name's Conor Colgan. I'm a technical product manager focusing on AWS at ClearData. I've been with ClearData for 4.5 years, and most of that time was the solutions architect, and now transitioned into the product ownership and management role. And as both a solutions architect and a product manager, I have the pleasure of talking to our customers and trying to find ways that we can help them. So they try to talk about some of the problems they might be facing and how technology can help them, and then how we can even go beyond that and help them drive innovation with the cloud, such as AWS, all while ensuring that they maintain compliance for all of their healthcare data. So my day consists mostly of looking at some of the work that Herc and his team do and evangelizing that to our customers and ensuring it helps meet their needs and help solve their problems. And then always looking for new ones and looking for new places where we can innovate and help solve more customer problems in healthcare.
It's great. Speaking of innovation, as you just mentioned, I think the audience will be really excited to learn a little bit today around Amazon Comprehend Medical. Would you mind kind of describing the service to the audience and kind of the intent of it?
Certainly. So Amazon Comprehend Medical is Amazon's medical-focused natural language processing service. So it allows you to send large amounts of unstructured data. Think of a medical note that a doctor might write about a patient visit. And it can allow you to detect and pull out what's known as entities. So think of a note, say Conor went to the doctor for shoulder pain. He was taking Advil, and the doctor asked, "Are you also taking Tylenol?" Conor said no. If you just read that, obviously it's a short note, you can pick out certain pieces of it, but by doing it through a service and a natural language processing, it can easily determine all of those pieces automatically. So patient name, the symptom, a piece of anatomy, as well as the medicine that they're both taking and not taking, because it's very important to note negation and saying that a patient may not be taking certain medicine. And Amazon's AWS's drive for Comprehend Medical is to allow and enable healthcare to get at more of their data. Most healthcare data is in the form of those notes or some other form of unstructured data. And one of the drives for the healthcare industry in general is what's known as either value-based care, patient-driven care, population care, all of these incentives to do more with less. So you need to have more data to help drive outcomes and help be more accurate with patient outcomes. And in order to get at that data, you need to be able to understand what's in there. So the vast majority of healthcare data, something over 80%, is in that unstructured form. Meaning if someone wants to go get at it, they're not going to be able to, or it's going to be very time consuming. And that causes a problem because it's a challenge that most organizations simply don't do anything with the data. They want to be able to do these things to it, but it's a huge challenge, a huge lift. One of the examples that Amazon gives was around clinical trials. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 90% of clinical trials go unfulfilled. And it's not because of lack of funding or that the trial fails. It's that they can't even get it off the ground because they don't have enough patients that meet the specific needs for the trial to even get it started. So Amazon worked with a hospital out of Seattle that allowed them to ingest medical records, and they put tens of thousands of records in to be able to pull out that data, to extract the notes and the fields and put all the data together to look for the folks that met that clinical trial need. And that way they could go much more easily identify the patients that met that very specific. So rather than running a simple search for like patient of an age or a gender, you can build out much more valuable data because you can get at the notes, you can get the medications, the symptoms, the dosage, all of these very specific pieces and how they all tie together. And then you can build out a better population to represent a trial. And they saw great success. In the time it took to process for a normal trial, they were able to magnify it by tens of times better. It was much easier to ingest the data and review it and come up with something and make it more impactful so they could start those trials.
It's interesting, I mentioned in a previous podcast that we just did from HIMSS. This was my 6th HIMSS, and it's so interesting you mentioned unstructured data. For all of the HIMSS I've attended, conversation is always around how to use that unstructured data, how to get at it either through interoperability or through other technologies. But it's so interesting now to actually see it come to fruition with EMRs, and you have to think practically. In one of Conor's examples, regarding going into the doc and getting asked multiple questions. If you think about the average urgent care visit being less than 15 minutes of interacting with the actual physician or nurse practitioner, they're not going to have time to read all that unstructured data. So the more we can kind of help correlate the data for trends on what's gone on with your medical record over the course of your life across multiple EMRs, we think the deeper impact that we can have, in the greater good. Switching to kind of how we all got started on this, Herc, I'd love to hear your perspective. How did you and the organization get started with Comprehend Medical? Could you kind of walk us through that journey?
Sure. Just for starters, for some context, AWS has provided in varying degrees, getting more and more with each day, it seems, machine learning and artificial intelligence services for a little while now. And as an engineer, and I can't speak for all engineers, but I think it's pretty common among us that we are extremely interested in the things that represent the leading edge of what's happening. So it's already something that's been in our imaginations for a while and something that we're always trying to find a good reason to tinker with. So I was pretty pleased when I was asked to a dinner with some of the movers at ClearData as far as architecture and vision are concerned. And at that dinner, I was sort of brought into the fold about the availability of a service that would potentially, be in our future. And as far as how the organization got involved, it'd be a much more tenuous answer from me. So maybe somebody else can expand on that. But my understanding is it was a series of briefings that took place over many months that something may happen to the Comprehend service regarding the medical field. Nevertheless, at that dinner, we were all asked if we had any specific ideas about how we could leverage a service like the one Conor described. And there were immediately, I want to say 2 or 3 of them that sort of bubbled up to the surface as very interesting. It was kind of inspiring because you see a lot of things out there doing AI and it's just almost wizardry. or magic. And then it's like, oh, here I actually have this concrete example of a way that we can have some sort of material impact on the world. And the idea that ultimately seemed the best was to be able to track individuals' health information, or PHI, as it moved through services that doctors, providers, payers are all using. And the number of benefits that you gain there it's just immeasurable, and as a person who's been a patient a time or two, I kind of like the idea that people are keeping track, or at least are interested in improving in how they track where that data goes. So then we went back, after that planning, and we had a really neat idea, and then sort of the fun began, where we got to start thinking about how we would actually do it. And since we're doing it with some already relatively new tooling to technology in general, with Kubernetes and the control mechanisms there was a lot of fun thinking to do. And engineering's not drab by any means. It's as far as I'm concerned, a pretty exciting place to think, but not every day is like that. A lot of days it's like somebody gave you one of those Mensa workbooks and you're just answering as many problems as possible, and none of them are all that interesting always. It's just one after the next. But this one was a unique case, I think. And I happen to still think to this day that it's probably one of the most interesting projects on which we're working.
Yeah, so the meeting that Herkemer is referring to kind of led to the first use case that ClearData came up with on how to use Comprehend Medical. And for those of you listening in, you're probably thinking, well, isn't Comprehend Medical just a straightforward service that I can just aggregate unstructured data into it and use it? And the answer is sure, but at its core, it can do so much more. And so, we came up with the concept around distributed tracing. And Conor, I'd love for you to kind of walk the audience through what is distributed tracing, and how is ClearData leveraging Amazon's Comprehend Medical to build that out?
Yeah, so distributed tracing is a concept in the world of microservices and Kubernetes and containers that allows you to trace user requests and data as it flows through the system. As you think about microservices in general, it can be hard to ensure there's no performance issues or errors when you're dealing with so many, oftentimes hundreds of these services everywhere. An example would be, as you're shopping on Amazon.com, as you search through things or save things into a list or add them to the cart, all of those pieces, all those interactions you have with the site are all driven by different services. And if there's an error or if there's a problem and you need to go ask Amazon or even Amazon on the back end, they want to ensure that it's all working right. And distributed tracing is how they can tie all those pieces together. And what we call distributed tracing for healthcare is looking at those same requests as it flows through an application. Think of a patient portal where data is uploaded and patients come in and access their records. You want to be able to ensure that you're able to track the PHI as it flows through all of those little services. It's really hard to build an audit trail into an application when you're talking about all of these tiny little services. That's a lot of overhead on the development side. And the distributed tracing for healthcare service allows for that audit record to be built across all containers. It doesn't have to be part of the actual application. It's utilizing technologies built into the container level that can allow us to trace the data and then mark it if it's PHI. And we're able to detect that data being PHI through the Amazon Comprehend Medical service. We look at the data, interrogate it based on the Comprehend Medical machine learning models, and give it a score if we're confident that the data contains PHI. So that way you can build an audit trail through your microservices. But everything's driven to get the data from the application through Comprehend Medical so that we can make that call.
Excellent. I appreciate kind of the understanding. On the architecture side, there are quite a few listeners who are using AWS already today. Herc, would you mind walking the audience through kind of some of the technical architecture considerations for how distributed tracing is built?
Wouldn't mind at all. The place that this happens is in a Kubernetes cluster, basically. In our situation, we have a couple of controls for Kubernetes clusters on the EKS platform, and among things like vulnerability scanning, etc. And this is just another component that we will be able to provide in that system. For now, I'll add, we're also looking at adding this ability to another container platform in AWS. So what happens is that when a request travels outside of a service in Kubernetes, there is a filter that in a sidecar that captures that request using Envoy, which is basically a mesh networking component of Istio. And once we capture the data from a given request, we store a trace for it, and that request is given a unique identifier. And then from there, it hits a service inside the cluster still that then takes that data and ships it to a ClearData service receiving API. And what happens from there is that we actually run the data through the Comprehend Medical API. And then based on what we get back, we can basically surmise information about whether or not it contained PHI. And then as these requests propagate through the cluster or egress it, then we have basically a historical trail of where each piece of that PHI data traveled. And all that happens with very few services. We have to capture the request. We have to send the request to a service that we provide, and then we do the medical processing and then basically send it back and store it as a distributed trace log. And with that, you can also do some neat tricks. So for example, you can generate a graph where you can filter by a number of parameters about a request, and then you can basically see visualizations about how it traveled. Or if it egresses, you could see information about, say, geographically where data went. And with information like that, you can derive status of the compliance of a given request. It might be like, say, using this data, you could take it a step further to then block a request that was traveling into a jurisdiction where that data wasn't supposed to be. That's basically it. The architecture is fairly simple. Not easy by any stretch, but it's fairly simple. We just capture the requests and then do some processing using Amazon service, and we're basically just handling the capturing and communication of all of that data.
Excellent. And realistically, that's a lot of the messaging from Amazon as a whole. Is you should be able to adopt a lot of these platform-based services kind of holistically to keep things as simple as possible. And just a reminder for those of you who are just tuning in, I'm Matt Ferrari of CTO Talk. We have the opportunity today to talk with Herkemer Sherwood, a development manager at ClearData, and Conor Colgan, a technical product manager for ClearData. We're talking about NLP. We're talking about natural language processing. We're talking about applying machine learning principles to it. In this case, we're actually talking a little bit about Amazon's recent Comprehend Medical launch and what organizations like ClearData are doing with it. And Herkemer just walked us through some of the technical architecture considerations. Conor, would you mind, maybe for the folks who may not be the architects, and obviously we've got a combination of both, would you mind walking through folks on the healthcare side what healthcare problems are going to be solved with the distributed tracing product offering?
Yeah, one of the places we see the most benefit right out of the gate is helping to build a more accurate inventory of that ePHI. As PHI moves through these microservice applications and moves through environments, it's really important to know what services have processed that data, when it was processed, who may have seen it or what may have seen it, so that you can have a good idea of what services are touching that data. It's critical for things like GDPR and the right to be forgotten, that you need to be able to go back and remove that data and ensure that it is truly forgotten. So it's not so much important, or it's not just important for where the data ends up living, but also where it went through your environment. So you want to be able to track it as it flows through there. And when we talk to security and privacy officers, they often ask for things like data flow diagrams. They want to know which servers and which services are touching their data and processing that PHI. And this helps ensure that no matter how the services are configured in that Kubernetes cluster. So as those teams expand out and as healthcare innovation continues and builds better and more interesting tools, they don't have to worry about building that audit at the application level. It also allows you to trace the data, knowing where it came from, where it went, so that you can build that stronger audit record if you need to go back and review or ensure that there wasn't any sort of issue with that patient's record. And it helps you build a better compliance story when you're trying to think about how am I addressing some of these newer regulations that are coming up around privacy and things that may be based off that GDPR right to be forgotten requirement.
Excellent. Yeah, right to be forgotten is such a hot topic in a lot of my discussions. And, as you think about GDPR, you think about some of the ongoing standards where the bar is always either being raised or there's threats in the healthcare industry from a governance perspective about them changing. And so to get ahead of those things is certainly something that a lot of organizations are looking into. Switching gears again, as you think about how to get started, while not an Amazon advertisement by any stretch of the imagination, with only a couple minutes to go, I'd love to hear from you. What advice would you give to the audience around how to get started with a service like Amazon's Comprehend Medical?
I believe that the first thing you have to do are know which gaps even represent the place where this can help. And fortunately, I think there's a lot of healthcare organizations that already know that, and it's not like an unknown gap that they're going to discover a use for this service. It's more like gaps in which people have been hungry for solutions since even before electronic medical records. Just historically, keeping people's information private has been a big deal. So anywhere in an organization where you see technology that can, without a person's eyes on each word, be able to tell you what medical information is in there, even if it's just like, did we talk about drugs at all, to the more specific, like, did we share this person's, particular prescription? So anywhere you have gaps like that is a good place to start, and identifying those is helpful because it makes it easier to come up with an architecture for what you might want to do with it. Of course, I have an obvious bias in this case that I think one of the good ways to get started with Comprehend Medical would be via using something like Juno, where we've identified a place where we can solve many problems in one effort, basically. I also think that it's going to be a big benefit to people to build on the foundation first before people start coming up with how to build the extra rooms onto the house, for example. It's probably a good idea to do this in places where you need the inventory, like Conor was mentioning. It's better to know where everybody's data is and then sort through the fancy tricks you can do with it afterwards. Baseline effect, people getting into doing this AI stuff need to be doing so to find out what they've been missing all along, and then they can start working from there. Comprehend Medical itself as a service, from an engineering perspective, is actually really clever, and it's quite easy to work with. Amazon, as a recommendation, Amazon has pages that cover all of their AI and ML services that are, as is typically the case with AWS, very well written and good documentation cases. So that would be my first recommendation to people, to even find out what they are. If you're just thinking there's 2 or 3 services, you're mistaken. There's a lot, and there's a lot of interesting things that they can do, and all of them can be paired with Comprehend Medical.
Great. I know we've run out of time, but I have to ask anyway and just go a moment over. Conor, in just a couple seconds, I know that you are talking to others about future use cases on what can be done with Amazon Comprehend Medical. Do you want to just enlighten the audience with what some of that is as they're thinking about how to apply this to their own practices?
Yeah. Some of the common use cases we're seeing around making it easier to get the data to Comprehend Medical. So oftentimes in healthcare, the data is not even set up to use the service as easy as something like Comprehend. So we're looking at ways, how do we make it even easier to get the data into that place and into that form that it can then be fed through and you can get even more insight. Herc touched upon getting customers access to things like AI, and we feel that this is a way to get that first step. So it's making it even easier to send the data there, whatever format it is. How healthcare uses data is very different. So that's the conversations we're having are around how they use the data, what form does it take, and how can we help.
Excellent. Well, Conor and Herkemer, thanks for staying overtime. And to our listeners, thanks for tuning in. If you have a comment about today's episode, please be sure to check out or follow #CTO Talk on Twitter, or follow me at MP Ferrari. You can always learn more about CTO Talk at HealthcareNOWradio.com or at cleardata.com. And until we talk again, I'm Matt Ferrari. Have a wonderful week, everyone.